We'll start in just a minute. Okay, well, good morning. I'd like to call this meeting of the Campaign Finance Board to order. The first item on our agenda is the approval of minutes from the June 15th, 2017 meeting. Do I have a motion?
So moved.
Second?
Second.
Any corrections or discussion? If not, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions?
I didn't attend, so I'm not voting.
We have an abstention, okay. Motion carries. Thank you. So good morning and welcome to the July 13th public meeting of the New York City Campaign Finance Board. With the 4th of July behind us, the 2017 campaign season is fully underway. In fact, today marks another important election year milestone as candidates reach the deadline to submit their petitions to the Board of Elections in order to appear on the primary ballots on September 12th. Over the weekend, candidates will file campaign finance disclosure reports with the Campaign Finance Board, reporting all financial activity from May 12th, 2017 through July 11, 2017. The deadline for candidates to submit their disclosure reports is next Monday, July 17. Once received, the board will publish this data on the CFB website in the days following. Importantly, this is the last campaign finance disclosure deadline before the first matching funds payments are made on August 3rd. Lastly, we are preparing for the 2017 debate program. In June, CBS New York, a co-sponsor of the debates, hosted town hall meetings in every borough. Members of the public were invited to ask questions and air concerns, all of which will be considered for use when the debates take place between August and November. That is my report, and at this time I will turn to CFB Executive Director Amy Loprest, who has a short report.
I just have one short thing. I just want to acknowledge that on June 22nd, our longtime general counsel, Sue Ellen Dodell, who was the general counsel at the CFB for 17 years, retired from the CFB after 17 years here, but almost 38 years of government service, first with the Corporation Counsel's Office and later with the Comptroller's Office and then with the CFB. So we just want the board to wish her well in her retirement.
And we do. I actually remember Sue Ellen from the Corporation Counsel's Office. The next item of business is just to note the candidates not appearing today are Michael Duncan and Mathieu Eugène. Therefore, we turn to the fifth item on our agenda, the candidates who are appearing. The first is John Liu. So if the counsel from the CFB board and the representative of Mr. Liu would like to take their places at the tables, that would be great. It's been my observation that once seating arrangements are established, they never get changed. So this is our tradition. So we'll hear first from the counsel for the CFB.
Good morning, Chair Schaefer, Executive Director Loprest, Mr. Connor, members of the board. My name is Bethany Persky, Senior Counsel for the CFB, and with me is Joel Babb, our auditor. Before the board is the matter of the John Liu campaign in the 2013 primary election for mayor. Mr. Liu was a participant in the program but did not receive public funds. CFB staff is recommending that the board find that the campaign committed the following violations: failing to report transactions, accepting over-the-limit contributions, accepting contributions from corporations, limited liability companies, or partnerships, accepting a contribution from an unregistered political committee, failing to document transactions, failing to demonstrate compliance with intermediary reporting and documentation requirements, failing to demonstrate that spending was in furtherance of the campaign, and material misrepresentation and fraud. CFB staff also recommends that the board find the campaign in breach of certification. And just one note about the intermediary violation: after the board memo was issued, CFB staff discovered that 15 of those intermediaries were inadvertently cited under the 2009 guidelines rather than 2013. That's the intermediaries for whom an unsigned statement was submitted, but the reporting was correct. And so those 15 should not be subject to a violation or penalty.
Thank you. Anything further?
No.
Thank you, members of the board. This is difficult.
Oh, Mr. Connor, could you
Obviously, it was a
could you
campaign.
identify yourself too?
I'm Martin E. Connor, and I represent the Liu Committee, John Liu, and the Treasurer, Shang Liu, no relative of the candidate. The only thing, and we're very happy that I think among all the major candidates for mayor, our level of fine, although there's $20,000 for the unfortunate convictions of Mr. Pan and Ms. Ho, will be lower than any other candidate. But of course, the candidate did not get millions in public funds and had no prayer in the election. And I want to thank the staff. The staff's been wonderfully cooperative, and they have a very difficult job. I think what the board has to address, though, is this idea of saying, we suspect you did this, prove you didn't do it. Because how can you do that? And I think on a lot of those items, if there was an oath hearing, and usually the money's not justifying that kind of effort, you couldn't prove it either, what you suspected, any more than the campaign can prove they didn't do it. I'm glad for the revision. We ran into a situation where we identified intermediaries, but because of all the publicity that started really 2000, I guess it was 11, end of 2011, and we were dealing mostly with an immigrant, new Americans who were the intermediaries. They refused to sign intermediary statements. So what can the campaign do? We had a dilemma. Do you report intermediaries when you don't have a signed intermediary statement, or do you not report them? And obviously, the whole purpose of the law is you report them, as we see it. And I'm 2 and 3 mailings went out to these intermediaries with the form. Emails went. Many of them said they had to talk to their lawyers. Their lawyers were good lawyers and said, what we're reading in the paper, don't sign anything. So we did report the intermediaries as we saw them. There is one item we're still being held to, and I think it's a Mr. Eric Poon, and I consulted, I did a whole lot of legal memorandum on who was an intermediary and who was not, and they were privileged once upon a time, but privilege was waived because they were introduced in the federal trial. But I note under Eric Poon, and I couldn't tell you which of them, but one of the people that Ms. Howard said, well, here's the the two checks he brought, I said, who are they? One was his son. So he's not an intermediary for his son. In some of the other instances, and the staff has responded and removed some of the suspected, but still on there is the fact that we have 5 people who work for the transit authority who made contributions on May 7th of 25, 25, 25, 50, and 50. Now, seriously, the transit authority intermediate these. The fact that these people happen to work for the transit authority, how many people work for the transit authority? And obviously on May 7th was a fundraiser. They came to the fundraiser. Maybe they came together, maybe they didn't. But I mean, to say, prove somebody must have intermediary, prove they didn't when you had a fundraiser and a couple hundred people show up, I think that's not fair. And I would ask for further reduction on that one. That's another case of proof something didn't happen. How do we prove that? And when it's a transit authority, we're not talking about a lobbyist here. We're talking about $25 contributions for people who work in the transit authority. And I think that sometimes is a problem for the perception the candidates end up with the board, having with the board and the staff who work very hard. It's a very difficult job. But, common sense says it's 5 people who gave minimal things. It's a little fundraiser. And so I think that's pretty much all I have to say. The one other item, there's a long list in one of the exhibits of, let me see if I get this right, and please correct me if I got it wrong. People we reported as intermediaries, but for whom in our records there was no copy of an intermediary statement. Now, I looked at that, and since I was retained, that went back to Ms. Ho being treasurer. And I know for a fact she prepared intermediary statements because they are the people in my legal memos who I said, these are intermediaries, and they got reported as intermediaries. And I know she sent them out, and nobody sent them back. Why there was not a copy left in the file, I can only surmise, but let me describe. The United States Attorney's Office should be in virtually every record, and they wanted originals. So these boxes and boxes of records had to be sent and copied, originals handed over. Then the Campaign Finance Board wanted copies of almost everything. And I'm not saying the usual submission of everything, but this was in the middle of the whole controversy going on in the press and all. So copies of copies were made. And then, of course, there came a time when, in all fairness, Ms. Ho had resigned, and clearly her defense was entitled to copy. In fact, under the state law, in resigning, she was supposed to keep copies of all records up until the date of her resignation and hand over copies to the new treasurer, Mr. Liu. So the defense had copies. These sound like the kind of things that would have all been in the same folder. And it just sounds to me like somewhere, I'm sure the feds got the original, but somewhere in all this copying, that folder got lost. But we did report the intermediaries. And I think that's what the law envisions, disclosure. And so we're being fined for record keeping, and it's like, I don't have an answer for it. Clearly the folder went missing in all that copying and back and forth.
On this last point, how many missing forms were there?
Well, they're for a lot of contributors, but it's how many intermediaries.
Well, just to be more precise, this is transactions reported as intermediated that don't appear in a statement. So it's not the intermediaries themselves, although that's how the penalty is structured. Speak up a little bit? It's specific contributions for which those contributions were reported as intermediated. So it's not just broadly the intermediaries. It's a list of contributions that were reported as intermediated, but those contributions don't appear on any of the statements submitted.
So it's a failure to report contributions.
Well, they were reported, and they were reported as intermediated, but they don't appear on the documentation.
On which
on the intermediary statements that were submitted by the campaign.
But they were, but the records that we have show there were intermediaries.
Well, they were reported as intermediated. So the central issue here is that the reporting and the documentation don't match, which makes it impossible for the staff to verify the accuracy of any of the reported information. The reason we require the statements in the first place is to check it against the reported information. There's also an affirmation statement where the intermediary attests that they intermediated these contributions, that they did not reimburse anyone in any manner for these contributions. That's particularly important in a campaign like this. And when we don't have the statement, we can't verify the reported information.
But go back to my question, which is how many forms are we talking about? How many missing?
I can tell you how many intermediaries, if you give me one moment. Do you know how many contributions there are in that?
Well, the penalty would have been by intermediary, right?
Yes, exactly. So
No, the penalty is by contribution.
no, the penalty is per intermediary.
Per intermediary.
Yeah.
Yes. So it's Exhibit 12 to the penalty notice, and if you look at Exhibit 5, Roman numeral 5 to the board memo, it's all of the intermediaries with Exhibit 12 listed under. So I can tell you it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
It looks like it's 31 individual contributions from that
So
exhibit.
it's 16 intermediaries, but then 5 of those are also cited on other exhibits, which means that they have separate issues either with the reporting or the documentation.
So the number is 16.
Yes.
But I'm just confused. So would we have a record in what was submitted of the name of the intermediary and the contributions that were purported to have intermediated?
Yes. We have the reporting. We just don't have the signed statement from the intermediary.
Right,
Or even an unsigned statement.
Right.
Right. There's clearly her copies of the things she sent out to try and get signed. I guess my guess is that would have been the kind of thing kept in the same folder, and that went missing in all this copying and whatever. Okay. But the point is, every contribution was reported, and the intermediary for every one of those contributions was reported to the CFB. So for public disclosure was met.
Okay.
It's a record-keeping thing, and I think I explained why it went south on the record.
Just to be clear, I don't want you to infer from my questions that I either accept or don't accept your argument. I'm just trying to get a sense of
I'm trying to get the facts.
The argument is. Okay.
Right.
Thank you.
And finally, I think, and I don't know if you've adjusted it, but generally, the penalty notice is inflicted, bad word, imposed on the campaign committee, the candidate, and the treasurer. But I think it's important to know that Shang Lu, the treasurer, did not become the treasurer until the end of March 2012, and was given whatever records had gotten copied for the third or fourth time by Ms. Ho. But clearly, when he had questions, it got kind of complicated. He had to go through attorneys and whatever. He couldn't just call up Jenny Ho and say, hey, what's this thing in this folder mean, and so on. But clearly, he's not liable for any penalties. And that just points out something I think that the board should address, and I don't know how. Under state law, when a treasurer resigns, the treasurer has 5 days to do a complete disclosure with the State Board of Elections, known as an off-cycle report. Your system doesn't allow for an off-cycle report. So Mr. Shang Lu ended up in the next CFB filing, not only reporting transactions that happened under his watch, he legally, and I know you have a notation when he took over, but as a legal matter, he's filing the report with a public agency covering a time period when Ms. Ho was the treasurer. Prior to her, well, even after her arrest, it took a while for her. She couldn't just resign. She had to go through the motions in the 5-day report. And I think you really ought to address that, because from a legal perspective, I could see complications for Mr. Shang Lu if somebody said, oh, that's a false filing with a public agency, and you made the filing. And I based it on whatever paperwork was left behind by Ms. O. And so that's just going forward. maybe not under the exact same circumstances, hopefully, but when there is a treasurer resignation, I think you have to adjust the reporting. I don't see that it's fair to make a new treasurer. The state board doesn't. That's why they make the old treasurer
Right.
file when they leave.
I'm not sure we can do anything about the reporting at this time, but my understanding, correct me if I don't have this right, is that we are prepared to assess to the extent that there's personal liability by the treasurer for penalties. It's going to be based upon the period of time that they served as treasurer and not for a period of time when they were not treasurer. Is that correct?
And he's not liable for the $20,000.
No, I understand. No. I was just talking in general about going forward because one could see he still had to file that next report with her stuff in it, and he's the guy filing it. So I just suggestion, and I don't know what you do about it, but I think the agents of CFB should consider some way to allow for, I guess, an off-cycle report, the way the state board does, so that the person responsible is reporting and on the line, and the next person takes over.
I have one question. In terms of this transit authority issue, what is the basis for us concluding that they were intermediated transactions?
So our system flags suspected intermediaries when there are a minimum of 5 contributions reported from the same employer, I believe within 3 days of each other. These were all reported on the same day. They were cited first in the review of Disclosure Statement 8, which was the statement in which they were reported. The campaign had the opportunity to come back and simply say these were not intermediated. They did not do that. They were cited again in the initial documentation request, again in the draft audit report, again in the penalty notice. A simple statement from the campaign saying these were not intermediated would have been considered and likely accepted. I don't believe the campaign ever directly addressed these in any of those responses.
And this accounts for 5.
I believe it's one, in terms of the penalty, it's just one suspected intermediary, but 5 contributions.
Okay. And there was...
Until you put the governor down, it seems he's running the subways now.
I won't comment on that.
I don't think so.
There was also one earlier point you made about somebody named Eric
Poon.
And did you have a response to that?
But I know I was told.
We don't know who this is the first that's being brought to our attention about the idea of his son being one of the contributors. That's not something the campaign has stated in the past. These were, as reflected in the board memo, his initials were listed on the contribution cards. They were all on the same day. They all have the same employer. And so that was compelling evidence to our mind that these were intermediated by Mr. Poon. I spoke with Mr. Hunter briefly before the meeting, and he made the same statement about one of them being his son. I couldn't readily identify that. None of them share a name with him. And again, this is the first time it's being brought to our attention, so we can't verify that.
I just know from my notes from 2000 and whenever it was, 11, it said Eric Poon, one contributor, is his son.
Okay. Anything further?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, next, Vincent Morgan.
Hello.
Hello, how are you? We'll hear first from counsel for the board.
Good morning, Chair Schaefer, members of the board, Executive Director Loprest, Mr. Morgan, and Mr. Snyden. My name is Joe Gallagher. I'm an associate counsel here at the CFB, and I have with me today Michael Iacono, an auditor for the CFB. Before the board this morning is the matter of the Vincent Morgan campaign in the 2013 election for City Council District 9. The campaign was not a participant in the program and did not receive public funds. CFB staff recommends that the board find the campaign committed the following 9 violations of the Act and board rules: failure to report a bank account used for campaign purposes, failure to provide bank and merchant account statements, failure to report transactions, failing to demonstrate compliance with reporting requirements for receipts and disbursements, accepting over-the-limit contributions, accepting contributions from corporations, limited liability companies, or partnerships, failing to document transactions, and failing to respond to the initial documentation request and a late response to the draft audit report. The campaign contests these violations.
Hello, I'm Vince Morgan. This is R.D. Snyden, my treasurer, so Thank you. 4 years ago, when we started our relationship with the Campaign Finance Board, it was the digs were not as nice. So there's obviously been some improvements in the space and all of the other stuff. So Ms. Lowprest, obviously we're moving in the right direction. I also hear that your systems are a bit different than 4 years ago. So thank you again for trying to make those improvements and hearing this out. I'm not going to go through each one of these things individually since I have an opportunity to speak to the board. I really want to speak as a candidate and somebody who was involved in the process to give some feedback on my impressions of what we went through and to answer any questions and sort of help figure out how this goes forward. The mission and mandate of the Campaign Finance Board is one that I fully support. Ironically, I did not participate in the actual matching campaign in 2013. It was purely a tactical move because I was running against an incumbent who was very well financed, who was so politically entrenched uptown. It was tactical not to go with campaign financing because it forced her into a situation where she had to actually go out there and do some work and raise more money as opposed to relying on just the contributions from campaign finance. So my Vulcan mind trick actually worked, and that year the incumbent, who was very strong, she did not participate either, which allowed us to have a much more competitive, more on the ground campaign, which sort of helped me, get as far as I could go in that race. A little bit about me. So my passion for politics really started through like everybody's, with Barack Obama's campaign in 2007. I had worked in government for many years for Charlie Rangel, who was a well-known congressperson in Harlem. I worked for the man, and I ultimately challenged him in 2010. So ran for Congress, was a part of the FEC, the campaign finance of the federal government, yada, yada, yada. I lost miserably in 2010, but my dreams of representing a community that was in transition and I felt needed new leadership and real ground up sort of approach to government as the community changed and is continuing to change. I decided to run for city council. Whole totally different experience. So my first commentary is Campaign Finance Board. Concept, great. But what happens in reality with campaigns is you take people who've never dealt with the system. Now, I'm somebody who had plenty of experience dealing with the federal campaign system. Much more complex, much different, and for obvious reasons, because you have, the campaign finance system here in New York City. You take people who aren't familiar with the system, candidates who aren't necessarily familiar with the system, treasurers. My treasurer was a friend of mine who ran a youth organization to help kids who are about to drop out of high school. Trusted him implicitly, had a relationship with him, made him my treasurer. We're going off to solve the problems of the world and run for the city council seat. I was required to have 4 hours of training. The treasurer was required to have 4 hours of training. We had 2 young people who worked on the campaign, or 3, that did the 4 hours of training. Training session. The fear of God is put into you in those training sessions to make sure that you dot every I, cross every T. Do not take any contributions or in-kind contributions and not report them, because if you're found out, then there'll be penalties and this and that and the other. You really are taught the letter of the law and to make sure that you cover all of your bases and keep all documents and put everything in, yada, 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 in order to comply and make sure that you don't get in trouble for the audit process. So we made extra effort during the process to make sure that we actually were very forthcoming with information that 3 years later now, when our audit was finally initiated, and I don't know why there's a 3-year lag time, but we had a campaign in 2013. We didn't get our first audit summons until almost 2016. It's a period of time where a lot of stuff happens. And a lot of information gets misplaced. A lot of information does. I physically moved houses 2 times in that 3-year period. My kids went from being in preschool to in elementary school. A lot of things happen. that don't allow for you to actually do it. So you get this training, and the time period between the training, the campaign, which is the most intense period of your life, to actually compile all of this stuff and make sure that every T is dotted and everything is done, and trying to comply to do what you need to do. To then no process in between, zero process in between, to identify potential issues and fix them before the actual audit happens. So what ends up being the case...
I hate to interrupt, but you're on a point that I'm reading something here. I want to make sure this is accurate, and if you're disagreeing. Yeah. This says the CFB sent the campaign the request for information on November 26, 2013 by mail and C-Access with a response deadline of December 26, 2013. Despite a reminder phone call from CFB staff, the campaign failed to submit a response.
No,
let me finish. CFB sent the campaign the draft audit report, DAR, on October 27, 2015 with a response deadline of November 26, 2015. The campaign did not provide a response to the DAR. However, the campaign's response to the initial penalty notice on August 22, 2016 qualifies as a late response to the DAR. Are you saying that you never got the draft order report in 2015? You never got the request in 2013?
I am saying that, and the specifically on that particular issue, I was called by a lawyer here that said, you didn't respond to this initial thing. And I'm like, what do you mean I didn't respond? I haven't gotten any notifications via mail or telephone. No, it's online. So, I didn't know that the response was going to come on the online system and not come because most other communication had come in the form of a hard copy, telephone call, or whatever. And she says, well, we've been trying to reach you, via the online system. And I'm like, you reached me on the first time when you called me in order to do that. And from that moment on, we actually had been in communication with the CFB. My treasurer had tried at the end of the campaign to facilitate an audit as quickly as possible in case there were any issues in order to get it done. We had, from the beginning of our campaign, now, I don't know if your notes have this. We had no fewer than 6 people we were dealing with when it comes to account management. 6 people. So during the whole time, we were dealing with a campaign account manager that we would be providing information to and talking. This is during the campaign and after the campaign. And then they would say, okay, I got your information, yada, yada, yada. 2 weeks later, you would call back. They were no longer there. It's been passed on to somebody else. Your documentation is with somebody else. And it was this back and forth that did that. So the initial response at the end of the campaign in 2013 was we were in communication with them, thought we were in compliance because we were communicating with an account manager. Shortly after that, we were told that account manager was no longer here and that we needed to deal with somebody else. So again, it reinforces the point of the campaign before they're presented. There's this idea that you have to be perfect, and if there's something wrong, the onus is on you to prove that you didn't, do something else.
It's perfect, and one of the things you say you don't want to address individual violations, but
we
not reporting. I just won not reporting transactions totaling $81,938. That seems far off from not being perfect.
We provided every receipt and every piece of documentation. The Campaign Finance Board has some of that information. You're required to. You're required to do it online and provide it in a hard form for that. The CFB has not been able to provide us with the documentation that we provided to them in the midst of the transfer of 4 or 5 account managers that have had this case. Where is my documentation at? Where are the original receipts that I put in? Anyway, if I may continue on with the next point. So the process with respect to the audit, when we got into this process and started providing documentation to
make up for the documentation that the CFB said they didn't have by going to recreate that, by going to make sure that we went back to files, tried to find this stuff, tried to do what we needed to do, provided that documentation for the audit to submit. We were truthful and forthcoming with what we needed to do to actually get past these issues. My original point was that we did not have an opportunity in the meantime, I feel, to actually resolve these issues before it got to the audit phase and it got to the penalty phase of the audit process.
Hello, Board. My name is R.D. Snyder, and I was the treasurer. This was quite a while ago, but I would like to address one of the things you said. The attorney that contacted us most recently was Ashley, I don't remember her last name. And when she contacted us, she said, we've been trying to reach you. And I said, how? My information, the same way you reached me today, is the same phone number, the same email address, and the same contact information that I had 4 years ago. I've never changed it. And her response was, well, we send it through the CFB portal. But once we're finished with a campaign, and we don't keep logging into the portal. It's not something that we think about once we submit the last perk work to for the next 2, 3, 4 years to log in and do it. But my point to her was that the same way you sent me this email that I just received and I'm responding to, it's why you see a lag in the dates, Mr. Davis. The same way you responded to me and I responded back in August because you contacted me via the email and the phone that's on record. So that was that issue. I do want to say that there is a huge difference in the staff and the way I'm dealing with the current CFB than it was 4 years ago. Every time there was a filing with a new person, every phone call that was a transfer to a new person, it made the filing and the process and asking questions a nightmare. Currently, since we've had Mr. Iacano and everything, it's been pretty much on track. There's a constant communication. We send in files. He sends his responses. But when you deal with some of these issues, there's a...
Yeah, absolutely. Can I take over from here? Absolutely. There has been a marked improvement in the communication back and forth recently. So kudos to what you're doing because it has been a better process. I want to go through two of these, though, because I want to give an example of how it's difficult to actually, sort of respond to this thing. I want to talk about a situation with a young man named Coral White, who is someone who worked on my campaign. He's a young man who had just graduated from college, and he started working on our campaign relatively early on. But you bring somebody on and you work with them for a month or two and you realize that there's some shortcomings with this kid. This kid was a good kid. He showed up to work all of the time, but, for lack of a better thing, he was a little bit slower in certain areas. Campaigns 1,000 miles an hour, and this kid was just not capable of sort of putting a lot on his plate. So I actually fired the kid. And I got a call the next day from his father. And his father begged me to keep this kid on the campaign because he was just graduated from school. He hadn't been doing anything, yada, yada, yada. He loves working on this kid. Please keep him on the campaign. I will pay to keep him on the campaign. I said, well, you can't pay to keep him on the campaign. But he's like, please keep him on the campaign. He needs something to do. Do not send him back home to me. He loves working on your campaign. He loves you, blah, blah, blah. So because this is where since we didn't have any communication and since we kept getting this transfer, so the campaign is like, how do we do this? I was paying this kid, so it's going to look funny if I then start not paying him and he starts showing up. So we decided, okay, let's do it as an in-kind contribution for this kid's time, since it went from a paid employee to a non-paid, to try and, reconcile whatever. Now, was that the right thing to do? I don't know. We tried to verify that with the account manager at the time, and they're like, well, we'll figure it out. Don't worry about it. We're in the midst of a campaign. The hardest thing you do in the world against an incumbent. So we made the decision to do that, yada, yada, yada. He cited in this as he made all of these contributions over the limit for this in kind. It was a 23-year-old kid who actually I was trying to basically say,
was working for us for free because I was doing him a favor because his dad didn't want him to be back on the street. You know what I mean? It's like one of those things where how do you reconcile that in the meantime, where it's an explanation if we had an account manager who could do that with somebody. It was a good deed that turned into a significant penalty for me because I was trying to do the right thing. So I appreciate the opportunity to be here to sort of explain the personal things that go on in campaigns that are not quantified in just documentation and the actual stuff that goes on. Here's another example of that. Let me give you this other example because I think it's going to reinforce what we need to do. I have two good friends who, one of them, Stephen Chikumba, who is a web designer. He's a good guy. I've known him for several years. And another person who's a graphic designer, Gregory Gray. Good friend of mine. We've worked together. I've known him for at least 15 years. They both do not make the type of money where they can write me a check for $2,500. But Stephen was like, I'll help you put your website together. But in the training, do not accept any contribution from anybody who has any professional experience, or that will be considered a contribution. And if you don't report it, you're going to get fined for it. I was asked for documentation for that in-kind contribution for those two in particular. They provided me at the time with an invoice that said, Restless Media, which is his DBA, an individual who has a company called Restless Media, to verify the value of it and to verify that it was legitimate. I am a web designer. I gave this to him. I provided that to the CFB, and then they say that I took a corporate contribution. I then had to go back and get, documentation from them saying, no, wait a minute, this is me doing business. That was just like an invoice just for my records to say that I actually gave it to you, but it was me that actually sat there in your house and helped you put your website together. The same with the graphic designer who helped me by coming up with our logo and branding, but because I was trying to verify that I wasn't taking an illegal in-kind contribution, took a receipt from him just to verify the value and to verify that he is in fact a graphic designer who actually has the skills necessary to do that. So again, the communication on issues like that, which you can explain very clearly to a board or to an individual in a face-to-face, it doesn't happen when an auditor is looking at a stack of papers and just saying, no, this is a receipt from a corporation, blah, blah, blah. It's completely, out of line, and you're going to get fined for that.
I guess a question for Mr. Gallagher, actually.
I did, yes.
I'm sorry.
So part of the problem with Cora White is that the records reflect that he was never paid. It's showing that there was 2,400 in expenditures, which were never, but an expenditure does not appear on the bank statement. And then there's also a reporting of 1,050 in-kind contribution. So that's why it's over the limit.
And Mrs. Outer, there was two payments that were reflected in the bank statement. So Mr. White received two payments of $400 in the very beginning of when he started work there. And then the campaign reported making another 6 expenditures to him over the course of the next few months. And those were never reflected in the bank statement. So we have no way of verifying that he ever received that money. And the two payments in the beginning set a standard for the wages that this person was entitled to. So then by going to work for free, those wages are then converted to an in-kind contribution, which puts him over an individual limit for those contributions, combined with his monetary contribution and with the reported in-kinds, and then the expenditures that never cleared the bank account.
What's your answer to the point that you could have easily communicated by email or?
Well, so I looked over all the contact records of this campaign preparing for today. On December 2nd, 2013, Lindsay Halperin, who's no longer here, who is a campaign services liaison, wrote to Mr. Sniden and said, I hope all is well. I just wanted to let you know that 1 week ago, an IDR request was posted in C-Access. This marks the beginning of the post-election audit process, so it's imperative that you open and respond to it timely. And then
was that an email or a letter?
That is an outgoing email. And then 3 months later, an outgoing phone call to Mr. Sniden. Oh, no, yes, I called Mr. Sniden regarding not receiving a response to the documentation request. He knew and immediately requested setting up an appointment to meet with me so that he could review the request. He explained to me that he went from campaign mode to then being a part of the campaign that lost the election to moving to a new job. There's a little bit more. They said I told him I would be happy to sit down with him, but since the deadline is long past, I advised him to email the audit department for an extension. I told him to CC me on the email. He thanked me for my time, and we will be meeting on March 10th. That March 10th meeting was then canceled by Mr. Snyden, as reflected in the contact records. And then on December 1st, 2014, Ms. Halpern, again, the third time, called the campaign and said, I called RD and informed him that this would be the final reminder from the CFB that the IDR request response was never received. He seemed shocked by this and frustrated that Mr. Morgan did not do it. He asked me if he could call me back tomorrow. I said yes and gave him the new contact information for 100 Church Street. There was a request from the campaign placed to audit directly for extension request a year later, which audit declined and said you must send all materials immediately. The extension request is denied because it's been over a year since that was first received.
And as to the draft audit report, is there any record of how that was transmitted other than being posted?
Posted to C-Access. I have to check if it was mailed in a hard copy as well, but it's reflected that it was opened by the campaign in C-Access.
It was reflected that it was opened.
That it was opened in C-Access.
I mean, an email, when things are posted, an email also goes to the campaign, to the contact information that we have on record saying that something has been posted. So it doesn't have the document attached, but it is a notice saying that that something has been posted.
Do you want to say anything in response to what?
Well, the email that's in question, it was a campaign email. So after the campaign, it was no longer functioning.
We have records that it was actually opened. So, I mean, we also can check to see that, that not only that the email was received, but that the document was opened so that someone was aware of it.
So on the filing report that's here, my concern was with the Coral White is the in-kind receipt. So I'm not sure if it was that the in-kind amount was too much or you didn't get the documentation for in-kind.
So what happened, the campaign reported $1,050 as an in-kind contribution from Mr. White for, it said, I think, an internet seminar or something like that. And then you combine that contribution with the $2,400 that was never received by Mr. Coral for his services that was reported by the campaign as expenditures to him. So he never received that money. So then that converts to an in-kind contribution. And then you combine that with his $125 monetary contribution, and it puts him over the individual contribution limit.
For combination of in-kind and monetary.
Monetary and
But
in-kind.
but they're saying that there's no record in the bank statement to reflect that the $2,400 actually was paid to him. If it actually had been paid to him, it wouldn't be in kind. It would be.
And I've submitted all the bank records, so whatever the bank record says. So on the Coral White, so the in-kind contribution letter you received made him over the limit.
All of it together.
All of it together.
Yes, all of it together.
Okay. And then my other concern was the accepting contribution over the limit.
Those are the doing business database. So the campaign accepted 3 contributions from people who were listed or their company, the entity on the doing business database that we use to check all contributions. Those contributions are limited in the amount that they can be for each election, and they were never returned or refunded to the overage amount was never refunded.
I believe I sent Mr. Icono an email about, is there a way to tell at what point they did business with the city?
Yes, everyone has access to the database, and I think it's Exhibit. I'm not sure Exhibit has the latest information. I had our compliance analyst look up the database, and all 3 of those contributors are still on the database at this time, and were on the database at the time the contributions were made.
Okay.
And also, I mean, so just for the board's clarification, that doing business contributions when refund those contributions before the deadline in that notice, there's no violation at all. So, I mean, it's by law that if you get a notice and refund them, and those are done in real time as the disclosure statements are filed.
I think you're given 20 days to refund the contributions.
I'd like to come back to the point that Mr. Davis raised in his first question, and that is the audit report indicated $81,000 in unreported transactions. Now, these are transactions that appear in your bank records, which you submitted. That's fine. But they're not reported on the disclosure forms that you're required to submit. And although the amount of that penalty is not the highest penalty, it's a very large amount not to have reported. Do you want to address that?
Yeah, I do want to address that.
It's of concern to us.
If you look at those transactions, they're transactions to like Fine Fair, which is a supermarket chain. My campaign was basically run as a street operation, and we had a lot of young people that are working for us as volunteers. But as with anything else, in the hot summertime, we spent so much time feeding these kids so that they would show up to work because we weren't paying them. So we had at least 25 kids who were coming every day and doing things like leafleting and wearing our T-shirts and out there actually promoting the campaign that we fed for. So I looked at the list of transactions that we're talking about. Receipts and documentation were provided to the CFB for all of those transactions. And that's why I said earlier that I'm questioning where our hard copies were. Our D came here and dropped off for our last filing period all of the receipts, if I'm correct.
Yeah, but
signed in,
I don't
not
think
here, but at the other.
I don't think that's the point. The documentation was submitted, and your bank records reflect the expenditures, but the reports that you're filing don't. So if you knew of the expenditures and your bank record reflects the expenditures, why weren't they in your disclosure reports?
And I would just have to say that if that's the case, it was my mistake. There is no other reason that, it was my first time, I was rushing. I may have missed that. I'm going to be honest. If it's showing up in everything else and we submitted everything else, it's not like it's not like we were hiding it. So it was an honest mistake because I submitted everything for the campaign. Sorry about that.
I'm
I
actually
live in New York
a little
City. This is
confused
my
now
car.
because if it's on the transaction report or on our bank statement,
It's only on the bank statement.
Yeah, now again, I'm the candidate, so
Right,
I
so
wasn't
on
the reporting
I already said.
the stuff into the system. So
So it was myself and another person entering the stuff into the data. So if it's not in there, I take full responsibility for that, and there's nothing else to say.
But where it goes in on the computer?
Yes.
Well, if you can, just based upon your recollection, just following up on this, there are some checks that are fairly significant in size. There is a check on March 12th of 2013 for $1,500.
I'm sorry, where are you looking?
I'm looking on the report of the unreported transactions debits. There's another transaction with the check transaction on March 28th. That was for $2,700.
It's Exhibit 4 too.
Yes.
I'm sorry, now I have it in front of me. Say it again.
And so when you just go down the list here, and there are a number of check transactions that were larger than $1,000, where the payee is listed as unknown. It might be helpful if you could describe, to the extent that you can recall, what some or all of those transactions were, and why those amounts were so substantial.
See what he's talking about?
Well, here's one that says unknown.
Right.
12, 8, 9, 13.
$2,000. He's talking about this. Give me 1 second. I'm sorry. So you look at this unknown paid $1,000.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't write checks.
I'm not even sure how that, because we provided copies of all of these checks. We provided the campaign when this came up. We provided them that we went back to the bank and the bank got copies of the checks and provided them. So there was a name on the actual check.
And the issue with this violation is all of these transactions were not reported into CSmart. So there was no opportunity for the public to have the opportunity to look over all these transactions because that is where the information.
Oh, okay. So now I was confused myself. So now I see what you're saying. So yeah. So But to answer your question, they were, because when I got this list originally, we went back to the bank and then provided them with the actual hard copies of the check from the bank record, which then showed that they did it. And he's now saying that they weren't input into the system.
Right,
for
which
the
is
old thing.
which
I
is a
got you.
problem because
That is a
the
problem.
bank statements come in later during the
Absolutely.
audit process.
I got you.
And the expenditures are not reported during the campaign itself.
I got you. And I mean,
And like
know,
I, and,
so
like,
this
like
is
I said, there was.
So yes, that is an excellent, very valid point. I'm the candidate, and you're right. It's sort of a surprise to me, but that goes back to the whole, mistakes were made, obviously.
we're here to address that.
We've been back and forth a couple of times, and I'm going to give you an opportunity to wind up. But were there any other specific things that?
Well, he did mention the
campaign, the candidate, treasurer mentioned that you wanted to address.
Thank you, Chair Schaefer. Yeah, he mentioned the Chicumba and the Gray contributions. So what happened there is, as he explained, I mean, they work for corporate organizations. They provided services that they provide at those corporations to his campaign.
They work for themselves. Those corporate organizations were their
But they're
companies.
a corporate entity.
Right. Yeah.
So they provided a service that they could have provided to other campaigns and charged them for, yet they didn't charge Mr. Morgan's campaign for those services. And because they're a corporate entity, they're considered in-kind contributions, or sorry, they're considered prohibited contributions.
But my question, though, is that they're individuals who happen to be the company. It's not like they have 10 employees. It's just them doing business.
And he could provide those services to another candidate and charge them for those services.
I think the mistake on that is that there are people we know who we all have skills, but the mistake is that when we put it in the system, we put it in as their company instead of them as an individual with the in-kind, and I think that's what triggered it.
That's a confusion issue because they're friends of mine. They happen to do this. It's like if I hire a plumber who's a friend of mine and he does plumbing work for me. I want to make sure that he's actually a plumber so he doesn't mess up my plumbing system.
Well, let me ask a question to council on that. So if the invoice had been written up as what was
the individual,
Stephen Chicumba,
as Stephen Chicumba, instead of as what was the name of the company?
Restless Media.
I like that title, Restless Media. Would that have been okay?
Well, we wouldn't have had the evidence that it was a corporate entity. So in that case, I mean, it would be prohibited in the sense that it was still coming from a corporate entity, but we wouldn't know about it, right?
Well, but how do you know it's coming from a corporate entity? I mean, he's both an individual and the sole shareholder of a corporate entity. He does the work. If he chooses to bill it as an individual, and assuming he takes care of his own tax issues in that regard, then the CFB would have no problem with that. Is that true?
No, I mean, we would have a problem. We don't make the distinction that an individual who forms a corporate entity on their own can provide services that are not under the umbrella of that corporate entity.
These are one-person corporations.
Yeah, I'm not positive. I don't know.
Well, it's like a service.
Can I ask you a question? Did we? I mean, the invoice says Restless Media LLC. I mean, did we before this moment? I just scanned the response that you gave to the notice, and it doesn't mention that this is an individual person who is and so that was the first time that I've heard it.
Yeah,
I think the response that we got about valuing these were documents from corporate entities.
Right.
I mean, so we didn't know that these were. Until right now, we had no reason to believe that they were an individual person providing individual.
Right, and what happened was that when Stephen,
I want to be clear, I was asking a hypothetical question.
What happened was when we realized that Stephen volunteered his time, I called Stephen and said, "Listen, I need you to send me a thing because it's an in kind, which you did." And he sent it on his Restless Media, and we just put it in that way. But it was just Stephen working with us, and not really Restless Media and that working.
Subsequently, they sent emails that actually said that I was.
I think some of these things are a matter of us resubmitting the correct form for Stephen or something like that. But we didn't have Restless Media helping us. We had Stephen helping us.
Well, Restless Media is Stephen.
No.
So yeah. It's a one guy. You know what I mean? That fixes computers.
His argument has some potential merit, but to say it's the same when it's a corporate entity, that doesn't work.
But that's where the confusion comes in. And I'm not trying to get into an argument about this. I'm just trying to say that it's one guy. You know what I mean? So you could look at it as that's a corporate entity, or I could look at it as that's Stephen, my friend. And when I say, one of the biggest things that I remember from my CFB training was the in-kind part of it. And I swear that part of it, they were like, in-kinds are a no-no unless you report them, because if you find out, you're going to do that.
in-kind
So
should
we
have
were
came from
like, you
Stephen.
got to give us something that says you did this as an in-kind. Because somebody says, well, who did your website? You know, we have to have something on record to do that. So the confusion comes in with that type of entity, because it's not Xerox that did it, you know, which is obvious. It's, you know.
And this argument applies to Gregory Gray also?
Yeah, he's a local Harlem graphic artist who, you know, I've known for years. But, you know, again, he's one guy who does graphic design out of his living room. So he's not, you know, GoDaddy or some other big entity that does graphic design for the web, which is a different thing.
And I would just say to the board that the sequence of events was that they reported these as in-kind contributions. The staff asked for a value of the services, you know, what these services would be valued at. And in offering that value is when we got the corporate invoices. That's the sequence.
And then in an email to Mr. Iacono, I sent a new template on May asking him, would this format fit,
right,
you know, of how you evaluate the hours and everything.
Okay.
I think we got that point.
Yeah, so
Do you want to wind up?
I'm going to close it up.
Good.
Because I appreciate your time and all of this. You know, I will say this, you know, I, as a candidate, it's frustrating. You know, you go through a very difficult period of time. I lost one of the toughest campaigns, you know, and the good and bad of that will be with me forever. And almost 4 years later, you know, I'm happy to be here because we're finally getting to this point where we're sort of wrapping this whole thing up. I appreciate everybody's time. I appreciate the fact that you are working towards making this process better for candidates that come beyond us and make sure that we get people running for office and doing what they need to do. I just cut to the chase. I don't have a campaign. I don't have the ability to go out and raise any more money. I am not a deep-pocketed individual. I do not have $21,000 to pay in penalties. So, you know, I'm in a situation where I have been going through this for 4 years. I've, you know, appreciate working with Joe in particular, because Joe has been Johnny on the spot with working with us and coming back and doing what we need to do and getting us to this point. But, you know, the penalty phase, I don't have $21,000. I'm a little guy who took on the establishment, ran for office, I lost, and now 4 years later, I'm being confronted with a bill that I just don't have the ability to pay. One other thing that I'm going to mention, and I mean, I guess it sounds like out of a movie or whatever, but I was recently diagnosed with a condition that has precluded me up until this point. I have gotten in the past few weeks approval to go back to work from my doctor. But I've been diagnosed in 4 years. It dramatizes how long 4 years is. I was out with my kids. I slipped and fell in January, and I hit my head and had what is called a temporary paralysis episode. Went to the doctor at Mount Sinai. They did an MRI and found out that I have a congenital spinal cord defect, which in February I had surgery on. So I'm not sitting in front of you wheeling in with the neck brace on saying, you know, I'm sick. But, you know, there is a medical reason that I have not have been gainfully employed consistently over the past year. And, you know, I'm staring at another operation on the lower back in the next year or so, which puts me in a situation where financially I can't do this. My treasurer runs a youth organization for kids who are about to drop out of high school to keep them in high school. You know, $21,000 seems at best punitive for an individual like me who doesn't have a campaign that's currently in action, that has no ability to go and raise money 4 years after the fact. I mean, to go back to your contributors and say, hey, it's 4 years after, can you write me a check, is virtually impossible. Not to mention that would open me up to another audit because I would then be raising money for the campaign. I hope you take that into consideration. Thank you very much for your time and what you do.
Thank you, and thank you for your appearance. appearance is Pedro Alvarez. Good morning. Counsel, would you like to begin?
Good morning, or almost good afternoon, Chair Schaefer, Executive Director Lowprest, and ladies and gentlemen of the board. My name is Cameron Ferrante. I'm an associate counsel for the CFB. With me today is Joel Babb, a CFB auditor. And before the board today is the matter of the Pedro Alvarez campaign in the 2013 primary election for City Council District 16. The candidate was a participant in the program and received $92,400 in public funds. CFB staff recommends that the board find that the campaign committed the following violations of the Act and board rules and assess penalties according to the 2013 penalty guidelines: failing to report transactions, failing to demonstrate compliance with cash receipts reporting and documentation requirements, failing to demonstrate compliance with reporting requirements for receipts or disbursements, accepting contributions from corporations, limited liability companies, or partnerships, accepting an over-the-limit contribution, failing to report and document in-kind contributions, failing to demonstrate that spending was in furtherance of the campaign, and making impermissible post-election expenditures. CFB staff further recommends that the board find that the campaign must repay public funds. The campaign contests the recommended violations, penalties, and public funds repayment. Thank you.
Counsel?
Good morning. I want to thank the board for the opportunity. I remember the last time we were here, I begged for an adjournment so I can go scour the records and hopefully provide both the staff and the commissioners with the necessary documents. Because of the stale nature of what occurred, I was only able to address the failure to provide bank statements, and that's really the distinction of what we have today and what we had the last time. I know that the staff has been very courteous and have worked tirelessly to help us in our compliance. I'm not going to belabor the issue. It was a grassroots effort to try to ensure that Mr. Pedro Alvarez had the opportunity to serve in the capacity of City Council. I know that the violations are all rooted in experience by the campaign. And despite the extra time that we've had, we've been unable to comply with the submissions of additional information. I believe the board should weigh and consider when assessing the violation personally to the candidate and the treasurer that this is a first-time candidate, is not a professional, and ultimately he was trying to do the right thing. And for trying to do the right thing, he shouldn't be punished. So we only ask that when the board does convene and consider when assessing the violations and penalties, that you would weigh that in to your consideration. And I thank you.
Thank you very much. Counsel, do you have anything to add?
No.
Good.
Good question. So, one of the issues that came up is the qualified expenditure deficit. And it's a result of the failure to provide timesheets for the workers who were subcontracted via Apple Consultants. And we saw the contract that you had with Apple Consultants and noted that there was no requirement that Apple Consultants provide timesheets for its workers. So I wanted to know if you could address this fact in light of the fact that in the trainings that you attended, that it was stressed that timesheets were to be kept for all workers, regardless of whether they worked directly for the campaign or via contractors.
Thank you. You want to address it?
Okay, basically when we were in the middle of the campaign, I have a really short contact with the people that were in the office brought by the Apple consultant to do the phone banking and also the locating the borders or the register border and I was on the street trying to reach out to the borders in the community, and I didn't have a direct contact with the workers of Apple Consulting. That is the reality.
In short, if I may, it was an oversight on the part of the campaign. The campaign did participate in the training. At the time that Apple came on, we were in the street as opposed to being in the office, and it was just simply an oversight.
It's not a violation that we can cure now because we couldn't resubmit, but that's just more a reflection of how unprofessional the campaign was.
Who is Apple Consultants? So that do you know whether they're an entity that has done other campaigns?
We had another campaign registered at the beginning, and then we changed because things were not working pretty well. We spoke to a friend of ours, and they recommend Apple Consulting to do the handling of the campaign, to be the company that is helping us on the campaign.
So
part of the question was, do you know whether Apple Consultants had done anybody else's campaign?
the response to that is no. Candidate does not know.
Can you just enter your appearance for yourself and
Sure,
your
I'm sorry.
client?
Yes.
Angel Cruz, 181 East 161st Street, Bronx, New York, on behalf of the Friends of Pedro Alvarez. Thank you.
Further questions? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. At this time, the board will go into deliberations.
Chris, can I just tell you something once?
Should we leave too?
You can wait. It's no problem. I mean, you also don't have to wait. If you, I mean, you can. Someone will call you at 4 o'clock tonight because we're very supposed to take 5 minutes of time.
Well, after hearing Mr. Morgan, I'm sure he had something to chew on.
Yeah. So, so I mean, you don't have to. It's like, but you're welcome.
Well, I think staff is courteous enough to have a copy of the file.
Okay.
In fact, we'll wait for a phone call or email.
Okay.
Thank you.
Right, so we're back in public session, and I'm going to report on our deliberations and call for a vote on penalties and repayments. The agenda has penalties and repayments broken out separately, but we're going to do it person by person, covering both penalties and repayments. I think it's the easier way to go. So, the first candidate that I'd like to report on our deliberations and then call for a motion is John Liu. And here are the violations that the board has found and the recommended penalties. First, failing to report transactions, $134. Second, accepting over-the-limit contributions, $250. Third, accepting contributions from corporations, limited liability companies, or partnerships, $750. Fourth, accepting a contribution from an unregistered political committee, $125. Fifth, failing to document transactions, $700. Sixth, failing to demonstrate compliance with intermediary reporting and documentation requirements, $4,100. Seventh, failing to demonstrate that spending was in furtherance of the campaign, violation but no penalty. Eighth, material misrepresentation and fraud, $20,000, for a total recommended penalties of $26,059, along with a finding of breach of certification. May I have a motion to that effect? Second?
Second.
All those in favor? Aye. Opposed? Abstentions? That motion carries. Next candidate is Vincent Morgan. The board's deliberations produced the following result, which we'll embody in a motion in just a moment, involving the following violations and penalties. Failure to report a bank account for campaign purposes, $122. Failure to provide bank and merchant account statements, $243. Failing to report transactions, $1,652. Failing to demonstrate compliance with reporting requirements for receipts or disbursements, $1,215. Failing to file and late filing of disclosure statements, $875. Accepting over-the-limit contributions, $4,411. Accepting contributions from corporations, limited liability companies, or partnerships, $6,115. Failing to document transactions, $263. Failing to respond to the initial documentation request and late response to the draft audit report, $1,398 for total penalties of $16,294.
I thought we had agreed to reduce the accepting over the limit contributions.
We did. The reduction we had discussed is embodied in the number that I gave.
The accepting over the limit contributions, 4,000. Did you say 4,411? I think that's where it was.
No, that was in accepting contributions from corporations.
No, for white, it's accepting over the limit contribution.
All right, I'm going to pause momentarily for a recalculation. Thank you, Naomi. Yeah, I've got it noted here, but it's in the wrong box. Yeah. Okay, we're going to put that one on hold and move on to Michael Duncan. The board's deliberation has produced the following proposed violations and penalties. Failing to report transactions, $56. Failing to demonstrate compliance with cash receipts reporting and documentation requirements, $110. Failing to demonstrate compliance with reporting requirements for disbursements, $250. Failing to demonstrate that spending was in furtherance of the campaign, $694. Making impermissible post-election expenditures, $1,583. Commingling campaign funds with personal or business funds and or funds accepted for a different election, $5,293. Late response to an audit documentation and information request, $250, for total penalties of $8,236. Recommended public funds repayment in the amount of $14,497, and therefore total repayment of penalties and public funds, $22,733. Is there a motion?
Second.
Seconded. All those in favor? Aye. Opposed? Abstentions? That motion carries. Moving on to Pedro Alvarez. The deliberations have produced the following violations or recommended violations and penalties. Failing to report 18 transactions, $636. Failing to demonstrate compliance with cash receipts reporting and documentation requirements, $1,101. Failing to demonstrate compliance with reporting requirements for receipts or disbursements, violation, no penalty. Accepting contributions from corporations, limited liability companies, or partnerships, $250. Accepting an over-the-limit contribution, $742. Failing to report and document in-kind contributions, $226. Failing to demonstrate that spending was in furtherance of the campaign, $1,054. Making impermissible post-election expenditures, $117, for total recommended penalties of $4,126. Recommended public funds repayment, $23,594, for a total repayment of $27,720. That's correct. Is there, so moved, second?
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Abstentions? Motion carries. Mathieu Eugène, failing to, the following, after deliberations, the board recommends the following violations and penalties. Failing to report transactions, $338. Failing to demonstrate compliance with the reporting requirements for receipts, $1,000. Accepting over-the-limit contributions, $1,100. Accepting a contribution from a corporation, $625. Failing to document transactions, $300. Making cash expenditures greater than $100, $100. Maintaining a petty cash fund greater than $500, $51. Failing to demonstrate that spending was in furtherance of the campaign, $226. Converting campaign funds to personal use, $2,245, making impermissible post-election expenditures $771, commingling campaign funds with funds accepted for a different election, $250, failing to respond to the initial document request, $878, for a total recommended penalties of $7,884, a recommended public funds payment of $2,000, repayment of $2,000. Sorry, recommended public funds payment of $2,000, and therefore a total repayment of $5,884. Is there a motion? Second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? That motion carries. And now returning to Vincent Morgan. So that was a good catch. So this. That's the way. Got it. Okay. So returning to Vincent Morgan. Whoops. Thank you. Returning to Vincent Morgan. After deliberations, we're recommending the following findings of violation and penalties. And we're going to start all over again. Failure to report a bank account for campaign purposes, $122. Failure to provide bank and merchant account statements, $243. Failing to report transactions, $1,652. Failing to demonstrate compliance with reporting requirements for receipts or disbursements, $1,215. Failing to file and late filing of disclosure statements, $875. Accepting over the limit contributions, $3,336. Accepting contributions from corporations, limited liability companies, or partnerships, $6,115. Failing to document transactions, $263. Failing to respond to the initial documentation request and late response to the draft audit report, $1,398, for total recommended penalties of $15,219. Is there a motion? Second?
Second.
All those in favor? Aye. Opposed? Abstentions? That motion carries. And that is the end of that item on our agenda. And so we do need to, I'll now entertain a vote to go into executive session to discuss pending litigation and other matters.
So moved.
Second?
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. No, opposed? Abstentions? So we will now repair to executive session, and there will not be any further public session. Thank you.